Cary, I was thinking back through the columnists at the Express News and the Old San Antonio Light through the years, the Metro columnists, the lead columnists, and I think that almost all of us grew up somewhere else. Roddy grew up, I think, in East Texas. Marshall, yes. Paul Thompson grew up somewhere else, but I think back east. I grew up in St. Louis. Carlos Guerra grew up in Raymondville. I guess Chasnoff grew up here, but I find it very interesting. I think it adds richness to your columns, and so I'd like to spend the first part of our limited time. I want to hear more about your childhood growing up on the East Side.
Well, you know, the East Side is not that every place we grow up in defines us. Every neighborhood defines us, and I didn't appreciate until I was an adult that how much I am made up by the East Side, but also how protected I was, because I lived, you know, where I lived on a corner in Denver Heights was only 5 minutes away from where my other grandmother lived. I lived with one grandmother, my mom, and I lived 5 minutes away from my other grandmother. The church I went to was less than 5 minutes away.
It was a very different neighborhood. It was almost entirely African American.
Mostly African American. There was some Latinos. It was not unusual to hear Tejano music and R&B music being played. When the rare times when we did have whites move into the neighborhood, they didn't stay too long, and something even as a child you instinctively know is that they were probably poorer than us, and we weren't poor, we were middle class, but if we figured that if white folks were moving into our neighborhood, then they must have really been bad off, which says a lot about maybe how we thought of ourselves or black neighborhoods. But unlike today, the whites who moved into neighborhoods didn't stay very long.
Yeah, but it was a solid neighborhood. Tell me about your parents, a little bit about your parents.
My father, Charles Clack Jr., was actually the first investigator on the Bexar County Sheriff's Department, first black investigator on the Bexar County Sheriff's Department. And my mother, Jenny Clack, worked for Kelly and the governor all of her life. And they divorced when I was about 4 or 5.
Oh my, yeah.
Yeah, and but I had uncles, I had my other grandparents, I always had folks around me, and although my father usually worked in other cities and other states, he always kept in touch. So I mean, I wasn't like
he was in your life.
He was in my life.
Yeah, yeah.
And I lived, and I was, the house that I was raised in was a house that my great grandfather bought in 1944 when my mom was 3. So, and so my mom still lives.
Yeah. Did your father, by any chance, ever talk to you about what it was like being one of very few African Americans in law enforcement in San Antonio?
Yeah, we would talk about some of his experiences, some of the problems he would have when it came to race mostly came from out in the community when he was working a case or making a call than he did within the force. But there were some other blacks who kind of supported each other. But he talked also about the fact, we would talk about affirmative action, and how he doesn't doubt that affirmative action played some part in his rise, but it was also because he was qualified. And it's like I think that most African Americans who have benefited from some form of affirmative action have done so because they were qualified, but also because that there were so few of them in whatever position that they were being promoted for.
One of the things to put affirmative action in perspective, when I was in 1967 a summer intern at the Light, all 4 of us summer interns were white males, and I considered that to be, I didn't at the time, but now I consider it to be affirmative action. So it's nothing new.
It's historical affirmative action.
Some people get into Yale
when affirmative action was white. Yeah.
Right, exactly, exactly. Now you went to St. Gerard's High School. That's not out of the normal course of going through public schools because you're not Catholic.
No.
So how did you end up going to St. Gerard's?
All of my education from, with the exception of first grade, all of my education from kindergarten through college was Catholic. I'm a Methodist, and we belong to the oldest black church in San Antonio, St. Paul United Methodist Church. But I think my mom was kind of skeptical of the public schools that we would have to go to, me and my younger brother, and she felt that we would get something different and maybe be a little bit safer if we went to Catholic schools. So we went to Our Lady of Perpetual Help, and that closed, and then went to St. George Elementary for 8th grade, and then St. George High School.
Mm-hmm. And then St. Mary's University.
St. Mary's University.
Yeah, you and I shared some
That's
professors, although they had gray hair by the time you had
Charlie
them.
Cottrell.
Charlie Cottrell was very, very young when I first had him as a professor. You know, I don't think anybody becomes a writer without having been a reader. How did you become a reader?
I don't remember there not being books around. I guess at some point early on, I must have expressed an interest because, you know, my family always made sure I had books when I was growing up. And, you know, the one year I went to public school was CUNY Elementary. And my first grade teacher, who was my mother's first grade teacher, told her that I would be a writer. And so I've always, I don't remember not writing, I don't remember not reading. And I would always get books for Christmas and for birthday, but they came as I got older, people stopped giving me books because they assumed that maybe I'd already bought them or read them. And I mean, I'm 60 years old. I just want to tell everybody now that don't ever assume that I already have the book. Please buy me books and send them to me.
That was pretty blatant.
It was.
You know, when I first decided what I wanted to be, it was a newspaper man. But I have the impression that you decided, and you just kind of confirmed it, that you wanted to be a writer. Now, those are two different notions. I mean, I wanted the excitement of being in a newsroom and going out and being a reporter, and the writing is not considered to be that important part of that. It's important, but it's not what your identity is. So talk to me a little bit about, as you got old enough to really be focused on it, wanting to become a writer, and at some point what you decided you wanted to do was to write for a newspaper.
I didn't, yeah, thing is, Rick, I didn't really think I wanted to be a writer until I was at St. Mary's. I mean, it was something I did, but I didn't really start thinking about it seriously until I was the summer of my junior year when I went to the King Center in Atlanta as an intern, Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, and I was placed with Mrs. King, Coretta Scott King's communications director. And I would write CNN commentaries for Mrs. King. And I had already started writing some pieces for the San Antonio Snap, black newspaper on the East Side. And I don't know when it clicked that I wanted to write something, but I would write something, and literally early in the morning I would drop it over the transom of the San Antonio Snap because I was embarrassed. I didn't want them to I was just embarrassed. I was shy. And Mr. Coleman called and said he was going to run it. So that's how I started publishing things. And then a few months later, I went to the Kingston in Atlanta, and I came back. I did start thinking for the first time about maybe writing for a living. And by the time I graduated from St. Mary's, I didn't have much to send to newspapers. So I didn't have a portfolio. I had a few things I'd written for the Rattler and San Antonio Snap. And so I did have this, I wanted to write. I just felt that newspapers would be the best avenue for me to write. But, you know, I graduated from St. Mary's in 85, and it wasn't until 94 that I got my foot in the door at the Express News, thanks to Maury Maverick Jr. But, so there was like 9 years where I was aspiring to be a newspaper writer, a newspaper columnist, and I was sending out packages to everywhere. In fact, and I've reminded you of this, there was a point when I sent you a letter asking you for, you know, advice. How do I get a shot at a newspaper? And, you know, you not only, you know, I mean, you could have written and that would have been great, but you called me. You called me and we talked, and you talked about trying to get on at a small newspaper or whatever. But just the fact that you took the time out to call me meant a lot. So, because I didn't have anywhere else to turn to for advice, and eventually things clicked. And my way of getting to the newspaper was unconventional, and I was older than most folks walking into a newsroom for the first time. But it's also why I never took it for granted and always enjoyed it.
How did you get to know Maury? And what a great character.
I knew who Maury Maverick Jr. was from his column. And I also read a biography of his father, Maury Sr. And I met Maury. And I didn't learn later whose typewriter shop it was, but I met Maury in a typewriter shop on Godiad Road, and I learned years later that the typewriter shop belonged to Jay Brandon's father. Oh. And I say hello to Maury Maverick, and the first thing he says to me, he doesn't know me, "Black people need another Malcolm X." And that's okay. I don't disagree.
Yeah.
But one thing led to another, and eventually he found out what I wanted to do, and he, made connections with Bob Richter, who was on the editorial board, and they had me write something. One thing led to another.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's good. When you started writing the column, what were you trying to do with it?
I just wanted to write. I wanted to comment on things that were happening around me and were happening in our city and the world, and I wanted to do it in a way that was unique to the way that I wrote. By the time I got to the paper, and when I had a weekly column, then twice a week, then eventually 3 times a week, especially when I first started, because it was either every other week or once a week, there were things I couldn't comment on because you and Roddy and Carlos or David Anthony Richard had already written about it. I couldn't write about them in a fresh way, in a way that I had to, if I wanted to truly address or write about a particular issue, I had to do it differently than y'all had, because y'all had already, so I had to write it, find a way that I could be fresh, maybe satirical or funny, but a way that even if people didn't like what I had written, that they at least knew that I had written it and appreciated the way that I'd written it. And then as I went on, I did realize the responsibility that we have, the territory that we have, and to use that to be able to comment on social issues, but also I think also sometimes to just make people laugh.
Well, you did do that. One of the things I found interesting is that you did not have a newspaper background. I once had a mentor who was a very wise man, and I once suggested that part of the ways we could get and hold on to minority writers is to get them mid-career. And he said, that's been tried, but it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is that, we're in a business that you have to do things that would be obnoxious in any other profession. We have to ask people questions they don't want to hear and write things they don't want to read, powerful people. Yeah. And he said, in order to do that, we have to get them when they're young and give them a taste of blood before they're civilized. And one of the things I admired about your column is that you were willing to, call somebody out, powerful people, politicians or others, and you'd call out black ones as well as white ones. And so it seemed that in that sense you hadn't become over-civilized. Yeah. Does that ring a bell? Is that? Yeah,
and part of it I think is when I was really younger and doing that, I didn't know any better, and you have this I know better than anyone else. I can call you out. I can tell you what to do. As I got older, I think I did become a little bit more circumspect and realize that you have to call your shots, and you can't, if you're going to try to speak the truth, if you're going to try to be true to your profession and be true to the things you believe in, that sometimes you can't let folks, even people you like, off the hook. Yeah. But you still have to be civil to them. You don't have to demonize them, but you do have to challenge people the way you would expect to be challenged if you did something that was questionable. Good people occasionally do bad things. Often. And bad people sometimes do good things, which Roddy was concerned that would confuse his readers. but I found that part of the richness of it. We're recording this at Child Safe, which is a wonderful institution that helps abused children. And
you wrote a lot in your career about abused children, and I'm wondering where that came from. It was a real passion of yours, and I mean, it is about ours, but you did it in I mean, you made me cry more than once.
I don't know. I've thought about. I don't know where it started. Now that I'm thinking about it, I would be interested in going back and seeing what was the first. Well, I know the first children I would write about who had been hurt were children who were shot in drive-by shootings. There did come a point when I knew that, going back to the responsibility that you have to use your pen, your computer, to do good. People would always say what you just said about what I did for children, but the thing is, I knew there were people every day, people who work at organizations like Child Safe, who deal with child abuse in the more intimate, painful way than any way that I had to. But all I did was I had a platform, and so I used it to try to put a greater spotlight on it. And I always thought it was wrong that the only time we knew children's names a lot of times was after they got killed. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the points of writing so much about child abuse, and I got burnt out. I mean, that's actually one reason why I started writing more humor, because I was getting burnt out writing about child abuse. But I do believe that the more you write about it, the more you report about it, the greater are the chances that when we hear their names, it won't be because they got killed, it'll be because they, did something great, became president of the United States, became, graduated at the top of their class. And so I just had a platform where I could write about it. And unfortunately, in San Antonio, it happened a lot. And you're right, Child Safe is one of the city's most important institutions. And admittedly, I'm on the board of it, but I felt this way before I was on the board. This is one of the most important institutions that we have in this city, and it's one of the institutions in this city that 24/7 is trying to stop the unnecessary suffering of children. Mm-hmm. Not the suffering that comes from having a bad tooth and growing pains, but the unnecessary suffering of being abused or being neglected.
Well, it was good for the rest of us that you let us know of things that many of us are very fortunate not to have that as part of our lives.
I have to say, early on, I got a lady left a message. It was like in 1995, because I remember we were still in the old newsroom. But she left a message. I had written a column about child abuse, and I never forget her accent. She had this soft Spanish accent, and she said, "You must have been abused yourself as a kid." and I wanted to call her, and no, I wasn't. I was not abused. I had a great childhood, and I always regret not calling her to disabuse her of that notion that I was abused.
Yeah. Well, you took some time off from journalism, from writing it. Yeah. And went into the political world. Very quickly, what was that like for you?
I enjoyed it. I left the paper in 2011 to work for Joaquin Castro's first congressional campaign. Have never regretted it, and it's one of the few politicians who I would have done that for. And it was a great experience because I believed in the candidate, and I became his district director, and I enjoyed it. I did miss writing. I did miss the newspaper, and I went to work for Ivy Taylor. Then I went to work for Merced Housing, and so I didn't think I'd be coming back to the newspaper.
Well, I'm not going to let you totally off the hook. You were in a world where being a truth teller is not always part of the job description. Yeah. And so that did cause some issues.
I have to say though that because most of the time that was with Joaquin, it was when he was a congressman, so I was his district director, so I didn't have to be a spokesperson, but I also have to honestly say that there was never a time, and I was also always worried about if that would come, but there was never a moment when I had to be deceptive.
Well, the
or say
district
something
director
wasn't
is
true.
more about services,
Yeah.
helping people with problems,
Yeah.
not dealing with big issues
Yeah.
and so on. Well, you did come back recently, not all that long ago, and we're all delighted. One of the things that was remarkable, and I'm so grateful for, is that you basically made an announcement that you regretted that you had not taken up racial issues very much in your earlier career, and that you committed to doing it, and I think you're doing a great job. But talk about what that was about.
I wrote about race more than any other columnist at the paper, and it's the way things are. That obviously, if you've had a life that's been impacted by something, you're going to respond to it more often. So I wrote about race a lot, but not as much as people who didn't want me to write about race that I always thought I did. Mm-hmm. And I know there were times when I became, I listened to those voices too much. And times when I should have written more about race.
The voices telling you not to write about it. Yes.
Yeah, and there were times when I should have written about it, but I was so self-conscious about it. And I realized, especially after this time around, with George Floyd and everything, is that many of those people who were telling me that, they weren't people whose minds I was going to change. Because I do believe in trying to change folks' minds. I do believe that there's a way you write, that you communicate, in which you can change folks' mind. But some of these people I wasn't going to, and I couldn't let them get in my head. And race is the number one historical problem in this nation. Mm-hmm. And to again have a platform to not address it, and to not make people uncomfortable with what I believe needs to be said and needs to be done, would be a total abdication of my responsibility as a columnist.
You mentioned earlier that you had been in Atlanta, and that was part of a program that was obviously dealing with nonviolence as well as race.
It's teaching the philosophy of nonviolence nonviolence as a way of life as well as social change. And part of being nonviolent is that you don't attack people personally. It doesn't mean you don't get angry at people and can't criticize them, but you don't demonize them.
Right. Well, we're going through a really interesting time right now, where race is much more part of the discussion, partly because of what's happened with a series of killings, most impactfully probably George Floyd. That's also led to civil disturbances, what at first were very, very peaceful, just euphoric, huge demonstrations, and things happening that NASCAR getting rid of the Confederate flag, which we couldn't have imagined happening. But it's also devolved into some shootings and some looting and arson. And what do we make of that?
In any protest, in any kind of demonstration, you're going to have folks who might not even necessarily be part of the group who's leading the protests and demonstrations, who are you're going to have provocateurs. You're going to have people who believe in the movement's goals, but who don't do right. Then you're going to have people who don't believe in the movement's goals and are going to try to make the organizers look bad. Overwhelmingly, these demonstrations, these protests have been peaceful, have been nonviolent. I believe they will continue to be so. But I also think, you had people after in Kenosha, the folks talking about how there was less support of Black Lives Matter in Wisconsin. To me, if you believe that Black Lives Matter, before some folks may have started doing some civil disturbances, may have started vandalizing some buildings or setting fires, which is wrong. Obviously, it's wrong. But if you believe that Black Lives Matter before then, and don't believe that Black Lives Matter after then you have to question what your commitment was to begin with. Yeah,
and some of the people who are true believers, maybe even a majority of them that are causing some of these problems with illegal actions, tend to be white.
That's, yeah.
You know, but and they're not provocateurs.
Yeah.
I mean, they are provocateurs, but they're part of. They believe Black Lives Matter, but they're, you know, they're like the guys on the dance floor, right? But I think I'm sure that when you were going through the training, one of the things you learned, SNCC was recruiting white kids from up north, and the reason they were recruiting them was that they knew that that way, when the violence was done on them, there would be a response, and. Nonviolence actually tends to provoke violence, nonviolent protest, and it's actually that violence that makes things happen. The violence by the people on the side of the movement keeps things from happening. But Derek Chauvin, by having his knee on George Floyd's neck, he made a lot of things happen.
Yeah, and Dr. King called it creative tension. Because if you have the nonviolent protests and there's no response and nothing's happening, so you have Birmingham where the children start marching, and then Bull Connor releases the dogs, and people are horrified at the dogs and the fire hoses.
And we get the Civil Rights Act.
The Civil Rights Act. Then you have Selma, and you have Bloody Sunday, where people are attacking. You know, where ABC breaks in. From showing the movie Judgment at Nuremberg to see these attacks, and it galvanizes the nation. That's part of the strategy of nonviolence, is not only to stop the cycle of violence and hatred, but also to stir the conscience of people who might be innocent bystanders. And sometimes that conscience isn't stirred until they see people being attacked violently and being abused by those in power who are supposed to be protecting them.
Yeah. Well, Cary, I'm glad you're back doing it, because we all need to be here and we need the truth being told. Thank you very much.
Thank you for doing this, Rick. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.